Hey everybody. Oh, our clock in the back is broken, I guess. Oh well. I was only slightly behind, I guess. Well, moving on to another chapter today. This book, it's kind of interesting actually, because this book has broken things up in a different way than most textbook, and that it has units. And so we have an overall unit that's on population, and then each chapter covers a bit of a subcategory. So we were already talking about population quite a bit, but in this chapter we talk a bit more about the ups and downs of population. Speaking of which, this is one of the graphics from our text looking at fertility rates, global fertility rates. You can see, well, according to these numbers, it topped out worldwide a while ago, a bit in the past, and so. And that's the global average, right? But that's one of the reasons why the growth rates in general have been slowing down. And I would say this graphic was made before the pandemic, and that intensified these things by a bit. A couple other maps from this chapter: population growth, 97 to 2015, and then only 2017. But you can see similar things happening, right, that we were looking at the maps from last time. Similar areas that are having growth rates, similar areas that are not having growth rates. You see a big cluster of purple up here, also Japan, right? China has just in this past year moved into that category of its population has slowed down enough that it started to lose population. Which was not actually predicted to happen for a number of years into the future, but as I said, pandemic kind of changed a lot of things. I'm not going to go through these objectives. Population geography. Well, we're looking at demographics. We're looking at all the different things that go into, births, deaths, the human lifespan, as well as what's called the health span. The health span and lifespan being different concepts. Lifespan, obviously, it's the average age of death in a different country. Usually that's an indication of how the healthcare is in those countries. Whereas the lifespan is, how healthy are you during that time frame, right? Are you able to work all the way to retirement? Or is life just kind of like too tough and people get worn down before that level? Populations historically have had lots of ups and downs. This is Rome, and when Rome fell, when empires fall, political instability, that tends to be a time when you have rapid population decrease. This being Rome, so it's a city example as opposed to a large country or the worldwide example. A city such as Rome, it emptied out, and large areas that had been kind of part of the urban core became farms, went back to farmland. And this often happens when empires collapse, because not only are a lot of people often killed during that political chaos, but a lot of people leave, right? If you have a place that everyone is kind of running to try to steal all the riches once the empire has fallen, you don't want to be around when that is happening, right? You want to get out of there. You can see we have a number of different population clusters, and a number of different clusters that are kind of like on the horizon, right? That are up and coming population clusters. But either way, as you can see, although, United States is a mover and shaker when it comes to lots of things worldwide, our economy and politics, but as far as a population cluster, not really. Usually countries in their immigration policies, very often these are tied to kind of how much space they have and how much population they have, right? And so, for example, Australia has actually through time done different efforts to increase migration of the country, because it's a large area. And even though a large part of it is kind of inhospitable, they're looking to bring people in. Canada is also a country that has one of the more kind of welcoming to immigrants. The U.S., population growth rates. We've talked about a little bit of these before already. Usually when we're talking about rate of natural increase, when I would say usually always, we're not talking about migration, right? So as we're looking through these maps and whatnot, the U.S. the U.S. has lots of immigration compared to other countries, and so a lot of these numbers kind of have more flexibility when it comes to here. Doubling time, number of years it will take a population to double. Pretty easy equation. And then urbanization, growth and development of cities. This really came about, and we'll study this in more in depth in later chapters, but the Industrial Revolution, right? Factories. Before that, everything, agriculture, right? In agriculture, well, you don't want density. You want people to be spread out because you need large tracts of land. Well, after the Industrial Revolution, you need people and factories clustered together to work those machines, right? And so it had the opposite effect compared to what had been going on for large periods of time. So when we're looking at things like the use of resources and whatnot, we look at lots of different scales, as we say in geography. Look at, of course, the global scale, look at national scales. This is usually when we're looking at migration rates added in, although the next chapter focuses more specifically on immigration. Or cities, right? Cities can have very large growth rates. Worldwide, cities are growing quite a bit faster than cities in the U.S. Worldwide, you have, as I kind of said before, people losing wages going down in rural areas. And so people are moving from those rural areas to cities looking for work. This has caused, at the city level, a lot of overpopulation, a lot of people moving in. In more developed countries, this type of stuff is stabilized by quite a bit. And I would say, this is scales of 2020. The kind of big story for 2021, 2022, 2023 was people moving out of cities, right? Because everyone went to telecommuting. And so if you could cities usually are more expensive to live in. So if you could just kind of move out somewhere and still have your same job, and a lot of people had that option all of a sudden and they took it. We'll see if cities come back or not. Like I said, that's one of the kind of interesting things looking into the future. What a lot of cities are doing right now, including the Twin Cities, is they're working on trying to change over a lot of business buildings over to residential. They're hoping to make downtowns just kind of big neighborhoods with lots of people in them. Since so many businesses have moved out, most businesses at this point have said they've kind of gone back to the office as much as they're going to, and that's been in general in the Twin Cities, that's like half as many, right? So you have a whole bunch of empty buildings, and so if we can convert those for people to live there, could keep them in use, right? World's most populous countries. Seeing if there's anything especially surprising. You will notice on here that, this is projected out to 2050, but this is a projection from a number of years ago, from 2010. You'll see they have the population of China decreasing, but again, like I said, that wasn't predicted to happen for quite a few years. You can see India is still increasing by quite a bit. United States will be continuing to increase by quite a bit. A number of places, you'll see that a number of African countries are going to be coming into the mix through time. Those are kind of the future growth clusters. One of the questions I had you ask, had you work on before, anyone else having just terrible allergies lately? Just air quality and everything? Oh, man. So, excuse me. I keep on getting paranoid that I have COVID, but I took a COVID test. It's just terrible allergies. Well, anyway. Last time I asked you questions about policies and what can be done, to increase population rates or to decrease population rates. This is some examples from the book showing you that there's been a number of different efforts through time. You can see early effort in France to try to get, well, people to have more kids, right? You see a lot of policies up here, a number of them to have families decrease. Singapore stop at 2 policy, but then through time, well, Singapore switched back pretty quickly to trying to encourage people to have more kids again, because once you get a cultural norm of having less kids, places just don't reverse, just do not reverse. But as you can see, a number of different things such as family planning efforts, China's one-child policy. Japan was one of the first countries to have their population stabilize and start having less kids. So they're one of the earlier countries to try to have policies that made it so having kids would be more affordable, right? And easier, less of a burden. You see on the top here we have specifically China, right? China's growth rates through time, and you could see that a number of different policies happened that were decreasing the birth rates already, not including, the Great Chinese Famine, famines, as we see toward the end of this chapter, things like that. Well, they have a tendency to make populations decrease, go backward. You could also see, well, once they had the one-child policy and population had stabilized, they went for the 2-child policy, and then progressing into the future, like I said, this has actually moved back here a bit compared to where it was going to be projected. But this is one of the reasons why I mentioned this before as well. When it comes to international investments, right? And well, what countries do you want to invest in? A country that suddenly has a much older population and a smaller, younger population. That is usually a place that well, we're not at the chapter on economics yet, but your economic growth is pretty easy to calculate. It's the increase of your working age population, multiply that by productivity. Productivity is increases in technology, right? So for example, Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more productivity in the economy. Populations were relatively stable. And so, well, when it comes to productivity rates, well, we're hoping AI is going to make a big difference, because honestly, in most developed countries, the productivity rates have been stagnant for like 20 years. There was a big productivity increase with introduction of computers and home computers, computers at work. And then there was a big increase when it came to the internet, interconnectivity, people being able to figure out how to do things more simply. But for about the past 20 years, it's been like 1% a year, which is pretty small. I'm not going to have you guys ask these questions. A couple other numbers of note: fertility rates worldwide, how many children are being had per woman, true death rates. Again, you can see death rates really had risen in this area of the world when the Soviet Union fell, right? Soviet Union, you could think of that as a big, large empire that fell. When it fell, people left the country, people stopped having kids because their economic future looked bleak. Places that have wars and whatnot, internal conflicts specifically, these are places that tend to have a higher death rate. Infant mortality rates worldwide. Again, this is usually indication of what the healthcare is like in a country. But of course, a lot of countries have issues that are unique. So for example, countries that have malaria, right? Malaria tends to kill a lot of children, unfortunately. And that's a type of problem that you don't see malaria so much in northern countries, right? So ones that are more in the tropics are harder hit by those. And there's hope actually that there's a lot of new vaccine technology you probably vaguely know about. There's a hope that they'll be able to actually finally have a vaccine against malaria and a number of other diseases from the tropics that are killing a lot of kids. There's a number that are kind of out and being tested. I haven't seen the data on how they're doing yet, so it hasn't been long enough for that to have an effect on mortality rates yet. Annual population change, overall population change. This number includes migration. Well, again, you can see what countries are kind of not doing so great. So influence on population growth and decline. We've talked about a number of these things. Economic factors, if incomes are going down, people start having less kids, right? Makes sense. Incomes are going up, people tend to have more kids. Political factors, not just war and instability, like we've already been talking about, but if the governments have specific policies that can help people have more kids, or are penalties for having more kids, right? And of course, environmental factors, famines, natural disasters, these usually don't affect worldwide rates. They usually don't also affect usually national rates, right? They're usually on a smaller scale than that. But at those small scales, those can strongly affect birth rates. Cultural factors too, right? How much of a norm of having kids does a culture have? Is it more, is it less? Usually, education, medical knowledge, these things can increase or decrease a country's fertility rate, kind of depending on the specific thing. But in general, better health and whatnot, more children survive, right? Can live to be grown up. Also, the role of women, another cultural factor. And I would say this is changing worldwide with women becoming more and more part of the workforce and having less kids in general. Oh, I'm not going to have guys do this activity. So a map showing specifically youth and old age populations. It's probably what you would expect in general. Again, if it wasn't for immigration, we would be similar to Western Europe here. You might be a bit surprised that this area of the world is not in the youthful category. Their population has really stabilized. Hasn't quite started going down. So one of the main kind of thinkers in this area was very influential for many years. Thomas Malthus, might have read about him in other classes. He studied rabbit populations and different animals, and basically what he saw in that examination was that natural populations of animals, if they're able to increase, they do at a very quick rate. And they will increase until they have used the resources of an area. And then when that happens, there's a great big decrease, because the environment around them cannot sustain them, right? And so that's when kind of some of the first thoughts about sustainability came up. And people were worried about more global growth rates. But specifically, Thomas Malthus, being an English demographer, England was one of the first countries, as we talked before, to go through the demographic transition. It was one of the first countries to be industrialized. It was one of the first countries for a lot of these kind of problems came up. And so it was a bit of, when they saw his analysis, that they extrapolated that in lots of other countries, right? So there was a worry about overpopulation, population exceeding its carrying capacity. The thought was that, like an animal population, a population of rabbits, they would increase until all the resources are used in their area, and then you'd have mass starvation, right? And so that was his main worry, is that he was afraid we were going to see that in the world. We're going to see humans just consuming all their resources until they were not able to sustain themselves anymore. Now, when you look at global population increase through time, you could see where there was a bit of worry, right? that as we talked before, in ancient times there was a high birth rate, but also a high death rate. So it was relatively stable, right? Slow increases through time. But you could see, well, I would say also in the 70s, people really started kind of talking about how quickly this population was increasing through time, right? And it looks alarming in this type of way. Another little chart kind of showing how quickly population was increasing. Now there's people who are on the counter side of a Malthusian argument, cornucopians. As you might guess from the name, cornucopians basically believe that humans can figure out a way around these problems. Cornucopians said that it's not inevitable that humans would just use up their resources and then have a great big die-off. That it's possible for humans to figure a way around things, right? That's the kind of the counter example, that humans would figure out new technologies, right, to face these problems. Cornucopians, as well as others, began to critique these theories, and a lot of different things that, of course, Malthus did not anticipate came about. Contraception, family planning, increases of agriculture. He really thought that the world wasn't going to be able to make more food than it was already making. But it did. Transportation, food preservation, these are again just increasing the amount of food that is available. See a map showing percentage of women practicing some method of contraception. This is pretty correlated to birth rates, right? And younger population in areas. There's what's called a neo-Malthusian school. Neo-Malthusians basically take Thomas Malthus's thoughts, but put them at the level of like not just what resources we have, but being able to sustain ourselves, even though we have a large population. And yes, we could figure out ways to still feed that population and whatnot. But like, what are we doing to the earth with this large population? And they use historical examples of plenty of times different ancient societies did use up their resources, and then the populations had to move elsewhere. Neo-Malthusians, just looking at sustainability. Actually, I think annual population change here, this includes immigration, right? But again, it's patterns that kind of we've seen before. This is a map from the book Elderly Dependency Ratio. When we talk about the dependency ratio, we talk about both the ends. We haven't kind of specifically talked about, there's a lot of older people in more developed countries. Those older populations kind of depends on the specific country, but in general, they're passive income earners. They work less. They get more aid from their different governments, things like that, right? Now, when we talk about populations and whatnot, we usually focus on the younger populations and policies and whatnot that either increase the amount or decrease the amount of children, right? We don't usually talk about this ratio changing up very much. I would say, since the pandemic and whatnot, and that has hit older populations more than it has younger populations. It's kind of the reverse of the influenza pandemic that was 100 years ago, because that hit a lot of children. A lot of children were very susceptible to that. COVID was kind of the reverse side of that, but it didn't affect it that much that we don't still have this elderly dependency ratio. Some of the hopes, as I said, were to increase the health span, perhaps new treatments for people so that they would be able to be active and vital going into their elder years, and even possibly increasing the average age of death by like maybe decades. There's science behind this, but not any huge leaps yet. world life expectancy. You know, again, a map that's maybe something similar to what you would expect. You know, this country, you know, I would be dead. I'd be dead. Looking at averages. Again, this tends to reflect, in general, kind of development. You'll notice that the U.S. is not, in this scenario, the most advanced. I'm not going to have you do a journal activity. Demographic transition model. I did talk to y'all about this last time, but I didn't really break it up into stages. It has these, well, as you can see, these different stages. I did talk about in general about how historically, right, we've had kind of stability with high death rate, high birth rate. Usually as places have developed their economies and their societies, first thing that happens is you have a decrease of how many children die, right? But the birth rate stays relatively high because people just kind of haven't gotten used to the fact that all of their kids are likely to live, right? And so during this period of time when this is the biggest gap, that's when your population is increasing a lot, right? You can even have the case where you're in stage 3 where your birth rate has started to fall, but you're still having a large natural increase because it hasn't quite caught up with the fall of the death rates. So through time, see as these things kind of come together. Then we have a phase that a number of countries have entered where you have natural decrease, a lot less kids, start having older population, and you start having population decline. When it comes to sustainability and whatnot, you know, there are a lot of people who make the argument that population decline wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing because it's less people using up resources. But what happens is usually in a different society and an economy, well, take the US right now, for example. We have a very low unemployment rate, right? Well, part of the reason for that is we have a large baby boomer generation who are retiring. And you have, let's say you have one office, let's say that office has 100 employees, and that office is basically used to making a certain amount of set product. Well, if you suddenly have 10 employees all retire at the same time, you'll have that business then want to hire up because they still want people doing that amount of work, but they just don't exist. They don't exist. So what increasingly those companies have been doing is, well, they've been promoting younger workers. Younger workers have been kind of moving up a little bit more quickly than they had before. But there still isn't enough people, right? I would say historically, well, our population, our unemployment rate has been around the 3-something mark for a while, and historically, it was considered that like 5% unemployment was basically full employment, because there's some amount of transition of someone quitting a job and then an amount of time before they get their new job. So the thought was, historically, that 5% was fine. Having it be 3-something%, I mean, people are worried about it getting up to 4%, but again, 4% is like, that's close to full employment. I've talked you through this stuff. Now this is a population pyramid of India. We've talked about this quite a bit before, but I just wanted to show you this to show you that basically India's population has really stabilized for a long time, right? Hasn't decreased, it's stable, but if it's gonna follow the same trajectory as every place else, it's likely that it will start to decrease at some phase here. But when we talk about international investment and people wanting to invest in places that have increasing working age population, right? I mentioned how economic growth is just your productivity multiplied by your increases of your working age population. China having a decrease of its working age population, Money's just been kind of leaving China, and a lot of it has been going into India, because you know that it's going to be stable for an amount of time. Cornucopians, well, I already kind of talked about them a bit. Well, I would just throw another theory in there. Cornucopians, like I said before, they figure humans will figure out their way past problems, whatever they are, environmental. Marxists would say that problems such as poverty or unequal distribution of resources, that there's actually plenty of resources, but that they're being hoarded by the wealthy, right? Well, that's a whole different issue, but a whole different way of looking at resource problems. I talked about China's one-child policy quite a bit already. Couple maps to just look at population and resources, thinking about sustainability. This map is actually on the border between Guatemala and Mexico. A lot of national borders are good examples to show how resources are being used in different places, right? So another example, if you look at this map here, you have Haiti on one side and the Dominican Republic on the other. Haiti has a much larger population. And so there's been a lot of deforestation through time, because people would chop down the wood for money, for resources. And you can see on the other side of that divide, that has not happened, right? But you could also maybe tell this area hasn't been brought into cultivation or anything. The chopping of the forest was just a mechanism to get some income for a while, but there was no effort to try to make a sustainable forest or to change that land to other types of productive use. People were just kind of trying to grab resources that they could get. Another example, this one at the urban scale, Mexico City, a very large urban area, right? But as they've been taking groundwater, the entire city itself has been kind of sinking, and sinking in an uneven way, right? And so using that resource more quickly than it's being replenished, changes your physical landscape. Another transition model, this one, well, we've already kind of talked about. Obviously, things like famines can have a strong effect on your growth rates. Pandemic diseases, degenerative diseases, all kinds of things can affect your populations, and if it's increasing or decreasing, right? So an example of how geography and disease kind of come together. Well, one of the most kind of famous first geographers named John Snow, not the Game of Thrones one, but John Snow, in a nutshell, within cities, especially during early urbanization, there was lots of pollution of different kinds that people just didn't even know what it was or what was going on. And so, well, people thought that disease was bad air, right? They didn't quite know what it was. Very often, if there was an outbreak of some kind, they would just move, because they would say, well, that area has some bad air, so we're going to go out into the country where the air is better. Same thing happened actually with like pandemics and diseases and plagues and whatnot. People would depopulate areas. Well, what he did it sounds pretty elementary, but he mapped the prevalence of cholera and where it was and where it wasn't, and was able to find out that the populations that were all getting cholera were all getting their water from the same pump, right? And again, like I said, that seems like a no-brainer today. At the time, that was cutting-edge science. It was like, well, there's something wrong with that pump. That water is contaminated. And sure enough, that's what happened. And as soon as people stopped using that pump, the disease receded. This is another map from the book, Non-Communicable Diseases, Death Rates. Very often, this is highly correlated with low incomes. Low incomes, populations for whatever reason do not have the resources, right, or the health care specifically to treat these different diseases. All right, actually, I'm not going to do it now. Let's check. Oh, and I've talked about these policies already. Yeah. I'm having some redundant slides. Talked about this already. Let me make sure I got all the main points of the consequences of a aging population. Well, I would say when it comes to the political effects, there is a big change going over politically in the U.S. right now. The baby boomer generation, obviously when you retire, you don't stop voting. But people in their 60s and 70s, the death rate very, very quickly increases. And so those populations, well, when you die, you don't vote. Not usually. Well, in these cases, that means that, well, there's a younger demographic who are all getting into voting age, and they're a large generation. And politically, they're very different. The generations right now who are aging and dying, the silent generation, and then the baby boomers. Very different social norms. We'll talk about that more when we get to our chapter on culture. But there's a big kind of changeover happening in the U.S. Yeah, I've talked about these things basically already. Well, I'm not going to have you do this activity, but I'm going to walk you through it a little bit, right? You have two population pyramids, 2018, United States, Japan. A question just kind of asking which country is at more risk when it comes to an aging population. That's a pretty easy one. That's why I'm not going to have you break up into groups and do it. You see Japan has a much larger, older generation, and then a bit younger than that, but still moving into the elderly years, another large generation. In that younger generation, much, much smaller. In Japan, like I said, they're among the first to start having policies to try to encourage people to have more kids. Those policies came out and people had less kids. Japan also even, Japan historically has not encouraged immigration into Japan, but they reached out to a number of people who, well, are of Japanese descent, but had moved to different countries in the world, and try to get those populations to move back. And some of them did, but the personal accounts of those populations and kind of, well, a lot of stigma that they would have due to having their cultural norms from other places that they were from, those stories got out and it really discouraged people from immigrating in, because, you know, you don't especially want to immigrate into an area if you're not going to be welcomed and considered a part of the population, right? United States, population pyramid, well, we do have a larger baby boom generation, but honestly, you can see how quickly the death rates increase and how quickly populations, well, shrink when they get into this age bracket. So the baby boom generation, by the time you guys are all in the workforce and stuff, it'll be even smaller than it is now, right? And then we have a smaller generation, Gen X, that's my generation. We're the generation who was worried about our taxes and everything was going to be supporting this big baby boomer generation, and it has a bit, but like I said, they're rapidly going away. We have a much larger millennial generation, right? Millennials, and they're in the age bracket that we call a demographic dividend. Younger workers who tend to, you know, maybe even start to get into the peak of their career years or their earning years. And then, well, your generation is still pretty big compared to historical norms, but it's not that much of a difference that you guys are really going to have that burden compared to Japan, right? Compared to Japan. All right. Summary. All right, I'm going to have y'all work on some questions. Actually, I'm gonna get rid of this one because I didn't give you guys enough time. But this time, I'm gonna have you take on different roles. So basically, when you get your cards, the lowest card is gonna take on this role, and then on up, depending on how many people are in your group. This is just to give you kind of different roles, because I know sometimes in these groups you could have the same people who are doing the same stuff. This will hopefully kind of change up the dynamic a bit. But a couple questions for you. I'll do the card thing.